Welcome guys to our coverage of round 6 from Norway chess. I'm gonna look at the game between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Krzysztof Duda in this video. Magnus with the white pieces, he lost with the black pieces against the Polish number 1, and we'll see in this video how Magnus got his revenge with the white pieces. So d4 from Magnus, Duda responds with d5, and they go for some semi-Slav setup here with these moves, and e6, which is the semi-Slav setup with these pawns. If you want to go for some typical Slav variation, you would often go dc4, but now Magnus has played an early e3, thus avoiding this as he can recapture immediately with his bishop. So e6 and now b3 for Magnus. Not the most common move, but he just goes for a setup with the white pieces, which is quite solid. He just wants his pieces in this formation and make his pieces ready for some e4 break later on in the game. b6 from Duda. Lots of options for both players here. They go for some pretty standard moves. And now knight e2 for Magnus, which is a bit unorthodox. Usually this knight goes to f3. But now the point for Magnus is that it can go to g3 and even allow f2 e4 at some point, claiming more control in the center. Bishop d6, they cancel, and knight g3. Big decision now for Jan Krzysztof Duda. Magnus might plan something like f4 in the next move. So if the standard move, queen e7, he didn't play this, but if he had gone for something like this, queen e7, then Magnus has lots of options. He could play more slowly with rook c1, but also rook e1 and even f4 is possible. Rook e1, of course, that's a signal for e4 at some point. f4 claiming control over e5, not allowing the central break e5. Or rook c1 trying to play in the c file. So 3 different options with 3 different plans for white. However, Duda went for the central break c5. This is the alternative to e5, which is not so tempting anymore because knight f5 is an option for white. This is the point behind knight e2 to g3. Harassing this bishop. Duda doesn't allow this, he goes for c5. Magnus captures in the center, cd, e takes d4. Now, instead of recapturing, which would allow play against an isolated queen's pawn on d4, which is not what white wants in this position, this would leave the bishop on b2 quite passive. He instead goes for knight c to e4, opening up for the bishops and trying to keep the center open so he can play on the king side. You see that Magnus has centered lots of his pieces towards the king side, which is a Kasparovian type of strategy. Kasparov always used to play like this if he wanted to attack on the king side, and slowly he would maneuver his pieces towards your opponent's king. And after a couple of moves, like for example what happened in the game, bishop g3, knight takes, de, d6, and Duda grabs a pawn. Magnus doesn't mind, because in this position he has 2 bishops, both very active, pointing towards black's king, a knight which could contribute on the king side, and also he's ready to double rooks on the f-file, which is potentially at least quite powerful. So this is very much like Kasparov in his day, in his prime, sacrificing a pawn for a long-lasting initiative without any major threats, at least not yet, but Magnus has lots of potential in this position. Knight c5 from Duda. Magnus of course keeps his bishop. Interesting that he goes for bishop c2 and not the typical move bishop c4, because the pawn on e6 is not crucial in this position. He wants to keep his bishops pointed towards black's king. Bishop a6, saving the queen, sidestepping this with queen e1. Queen e8, protecting the pawn on e6, and now rook d1. DUDA now, makes a mistake. It's not so easy in this position, but rook d8 is supposed to be the best move to challenge white's control over the d-file. Instead, rook c8 was played. Now b4, forcing the knight back to b7. Knight e4. Remember that the bishop on c2 is protected by the rook on f2. So knight e4, again activating the pieces. DUDA went for knight d5 instead of taking on e4, which would allow a powerful attack against h7. So knight d5. We exchange a pair of rooks and play bishop b1, just sidestepping this threat from the rook on c8. And the bishop is just as good on b1 as on c2, because we only want to create threats against black's king side. So the bishops are ideally placed on b2 and b1. Long range snipers, so to speak. Queen takes b4, DUDA now 2 pawns up. But he must have missed Magnus's next move, which is a hammer blow to his position. Knight f6. Opening up for the queen to take on e6, so no matter what piece black decides to take on f6 with, then queen e6 would follow with a devastating attack and a double attack against the king and the rook, which would force resignation. So he decides to play king h8. Magnus finishes the game off in convincing style, queen e6, rook a1, and just queen d5, exploiting the fact that if g takes f6, then this is, of course, mate. So this is a very nice game by Magnus. Of course, if DUDA decides to continue playing with, for example, queen b2, then a move like queen e4, for example, just threatening mate on h7 would force something like bishop d3 to postpone the immediate mate on h7. So there's nothing to do for black here but to resign. And he did after queen takes d5, a sweet revenge for Magnus against his Polish opponent, and a win that brought Magnus back into contention for the first prize at Norway Chess.